Coast in California, Oregon, and Washington, we get king tides along the coast every so often. King tides are not a scientific term, but are when tides are exceptionally high during full or new moons. The tides can cause flooding and damage along the coastlines, but can also create water conditions that are not safe to boat or dock crab from. A recent weekend of king tides flooded areas on the North Oregon coast and closed a bunch of dock crabbing locations because of unsafe conditions. When I hear king tides, my first thought is to stay home and stay safe. They are not to be messed with, especially if there's sneaker waves too. King tides are predictable weather pattern occurrences, so check with weather and NOAA information before you head out. So the only question I have about king tides is where's the queen tides? Number 3. Watch the wind. Whether crabbing in the bay or inshore in the ocean, you should constantly be checking for what the wind is doing. Now, wind isn't a bad thing for crabbing, but it does create treacherous conditions on those super windy days, especially when the wind direction is not favorable depending on where you're crabbing. Windy days at the coast typically create a huge chop in waves near the jetty or jaws entrance into the bay. And at specific crabbing locations like Nehalem Bay or Tillamook Bay, you have to be very careful of the wind forecast so that you don't head out for inshore crabbing and get caught in a windstorm unable to make it back into the bay. It's happened more often than you think where someone will get stuck outside the bay with too small of a boat and can't get back safely into the bay. Even in the bay, pay close attention to the winds so you can make it back safely to the boat launch. And if you see whitecaps in the bay, my best piece of advice, get out of there and head home. Number 2, avoid crabbing after big rainstorms. Now, the vast majority of bays and crabbing locations in Oregon are tidally influenced, and the water conditions change with large amounts of rain and fresh water from tributaries or rivers flowing into those bays. Crab love salt water, so when we have big rainstorms and significant fresh water making its way into the bay, the crabbing shuts off pretty quickly. My rule of thumb is to try and crab before a large weather pattern or rainstorm, and then wait about 1 to 2 days after a huge rainstorm event to go crabbing again. I found that it takes a day or two for that fresh water to flush out of the bay for the crabs to want to move back into the bay. And for locations where you can drop the crab pots and do a little winter steelhead or lake coho fishing, check if the river levels are dropping. That's the perfect time to hit some fishing when the river is on the drop. And don't be shocked if you have a banner day of crabbing and fishing after that big rainstorm. And number 1, crab the slack tide and the small tide swings. Crabbing the slack tides was the first tip my grandfather and dad shared with me out crabbing in the boat. The slack tide is when the tide is swinging up to high tide, then not moving until it starts to swing into the low tide. Basically the part in between the incoming high tide and the outgoing low tide. Crabbing is typically best during the slack tide, so I recommend putting the gear in the water 2 hours before the incoming tide swings into that slack tide. But don't overlook those days with the small tide swings. The smaller the change between the low to the high and the high to the low are really good days for crabbing. Larger tide swings thrash water in and out of the bay, and the crabs either stay completely out of the bay or they hunker down in the sand and become very impossible to catch. But those minimal tide swings produce calmer waters, and the crabs will hang out longer and head towards the crabbing bait in your gear. Then, it's up to you to pull up the gear and get that boiling water ready to cook those giant Dungeness crab. And that's my top 5 crabbing tips for tides, weather, and water conditions. Hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, hit that like button. Comment below on your favorite tip from the video or the tip that you will incorporate the next time out crabbing. And if you like crabbing, fishing, and other outdoor content, hit that subscribe button below. Now get out there and catch some crabs. Dungeness crabs, that is.